The wind howled fiercely outside, sending gusts of snow against the cabin windows, as if nature itself was trying to break in. Jack sat in his favorite armchair, the one that had become his companion in his retirement. The warmth from the fireplace flickered softly across the room, casting long shadows on the walls. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the heavy silence that had settled over the cabin. He stared into the flames, watching the orange glow dance, feeling the heat on his skin. It had been days since the storm had started, and the world outside seemed so far away. The snow had buried the roads, and Jack hadn't heard a soul since he'd last stepped outside. It wasn't so bad, though. Jack had always preferred being alone, away from the noise and bustle of the world. Life had been simpler this way. No one to worry about, no responsibilities weighing him down. He could spend his days in peace, just him and the quiet of the wilderness surrounding him. The stillness was comforting. He often found himself thinking about the days when he was a firefighter, back when life had felt like it was moving too fast. Back then, it was always about the next call, the next emergency, the next problem to solve. Now, in the quiet of his cabin, there were no alarms, no rush, just the slow passage of time. But as peaceful as it was, something about the silence felt different tonight. It was as if the storm outside had brought a heaviness with it, a feeling that something was about to change. Jack tried to push the thought away, reminding himself that he had chosen this life. He had chosen the solitude, and yet, the longer he sat there, the more he felt the weight of the quiet pressing in on him. He glanced around the room, at the empty spaces where once there had been the laughter of family and friends. Now, the only company he had were the shadows in the corners and the steady crackle of the fire. Jack took a deep breath, his eyes drifting back to the flames. There was comfort in the fire, in the warmth that filled the room. But tonight, it wasn't enough to quiet the unease that stirred inside him. The storm raged on outside, but it wasn't just the wind that made the house feel colder than usual. There was something else in the air, something he couldn't quite place. It was a strange feeling, one he hadn't had in a long time. Something told him that the night was far from ordinary, that something was waiting just beyond the door. Jack leaned back in his chair, the flickering firelight dancing across his tired face. His mind wandered back to the years when he wore the firefighter's uniform, rushing from one emergency to the next, always on the move, always on call. Life had been a blur back then, filled with noise and urgency. Every day was about saving lives, putting out fires, responding to the next disaster, and never having a moment to breathe. There had been a sense of purpose in it, a feeling of being needed, of making a real difference. But now, with the weight of his retirement settling in, he felt that purpose slipping away, like sand through his fingers. Sitting alone in his cabin, surrounded by nothing but the sound of the wind outside and the soft crackle of the fire, Jack could feel the weight of his isolation. He had chosen this life, after all. When the years of rushing from one call to another had finally caught up with him, he knew it was time to step back, to leave the chaos behind. The decision had seemed right at the time, and in many ways, it still was. There were no alarms, no rush, no pressure. Just the quiet of the woods, the peace of being alone. But peace and loneliness had started to feel like the same thing. He had traded the hustle of city life for the stillness of nature. But now, sitting here by the fire, Jack realized how distant he felt from the world. His old friends had moved on, his family had grown busy with their own lives, and the calls for help he used to answer had faded into the background. At first, he thought the quiet would be a relief, but now it just felt hollow. The isolation was his choice, but it was beginning to feel more like a weight, a quiet reminder of how far removed he had become from everything he once knew. Jack couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice. Was this what he really wanted? A life without the noise of the outside world, without the rush of urgency, but also without the connection he had once had with people? There was a part of him that missed it, that missed being part of something bigger than himself. But at the same time, he knew that there was no going back. His life had changed, and now this quiet cabin, this simple routine, was all he had left. And as much as it made him feel disconnected from everything else, Jack couldn't deny that it also gave him a kind of peace. a peace he wasn't quite sure he could find anywhere else. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as Jack sat there, lost in his thoughts. The storm outside seemed to rage louder with each passing minute, but inside the cabin, there was only the steady crackle of the fire and the quiet rhythm of Jack's breathing. It was a kind of silence he had grown used to, a silence that felt comfortable in its own way. But then something shifted. A faint scratching sound, barely noticeable at first, reached his ears. It was so soft, almost like the wind brushing against the wood, but there was a distinctness to it. Jack's attention snapped to the door, his body instinctively tensing. The sound came again, this time clearer, sharper. It wasn't the wind. He listened carefully, his eyes narrowing, trying to make sense of it. His heart rate quickened, and he found himself standing up from his chair, drawn to the door, as if something inside him already knew what was on the other side. The wind outside howled, but this new sound broke through, distinct and different from the storm's fury. A soft, desperate scratching. Jack's mind raced. Was it an animal? A wild creature seeking shelter from the storm? Or was it something else entirely? For a moment, he stood frozen, the uncertainty hanging in the air like a thick fog. The sound came again, this time accompanied by a faint whimper, a soft cry that tugged at something deep inside him. Jack's heart skipped a beat, the urgency of it pulling him closer to the door. He couldn't ignore it. Whatever was out there, it needed help. Without a second thought, he moved toward the door, his hand brushing over the cold wood of the doorknob. His mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, none of them good. What if it was some dangerous animal? Or worse, a person in trouble? But then, in that moment, everything else faded away. There was only the sound, the scratching, the whimpering, and the pull to do something. Jack took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew he couldn't just stand there. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just the storm that had brought it to his doorstep. It was something more, something that needed him. He slowly reached for the door handle, the air around him feeling colder now than it had been just moments before. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft sigh, as if whatever was out there was waiting, too. Jack hesitated, his hand still on the knob, but his decision was already made. He had to open the door. Jack moved slowly toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. His hand hovered just above the doorknob, his fingers trembling slightly, as the scratching sound grew louder, more persistent. It was unmistakable now, a frantic, desperate noise that seemed to carry a sense of urgency, a plea for help. The whimper that followed sent a chill down Jack's spine. It wasn't just an animal, not like anything he'd heard before. The sound was too human, too filled with pain and fear. He paused for a moment, standing just a few inches from the door, his mind racing. He couldn't understand what was happening. Was it a stray dog, lost and cold, caught in the storm? Or was it something else? Maybe someone had been caught out there, hurt or seeking shelter from the relentless wind. His instincts told him to be careful, to not open the door without knowing what was on the other side. But the longer he stood there, the more he felt a strange pull, a compulsion to act. The wind howled fiercely outside, but it was the quiet whimper that echoed louder in his ears now. With each passing second, the scratching seemed to grow more frantic, the urgency in the sound undeniable. Jack swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. What could he possibly find? A dog? A person? The uncertainty was maddening. His heart beat faster as he carefully placed his hand on the door, hesitating just for a moment. It felt like there was no turning back now. Something out there was waiting for him, needing him. And the more he stood frozen in place, the more the scratching and whimpering seemed to plead for action. Finally, Jack took a deep breath and slowly turned the doorknob. The sound of the whimper grew louder, like the creature, whatever it was just beyond the door, waiting for him to open it. His pulse quickened as he inched closer, each step drawing him closer to whatever lay on the other side. The air felt heavier now, the space between the door and him almost suffocating. He couldn't back out now. He had to know. What was out there? Jack slowly pushed the door open, the cold air rushing in, sharp and biting against his skin. He squinted into the darkness, barely able to make out the shape of something huddled close to the ground. The faint outline of a dog, her body shaking violently against the wind, stood frozen on the other side. Jack's heart tightened as he stepped forward, trying to get a clearer look. Her fur was matted with ice, her body thin and fragile, every rib visible through her coat. The German shepherd looked up at him, her amber eyes wide with fear. Yet there was something else, something that felt like a quiet plea for help. She didn't move when he opened the door, only shifted slightly, her paws planted firmly in the snow. Her breath came in shallow, quick puffs, visible in the cold air, and Jack noticed how her small frame trembled, not just from the chill but from exhaustion, from something deeper. Beneath her, almost hidden from view, were two tiny puppies, curled up tightly against her. They were so small, barely visible beneath the mother's protective stance, their little bodies pressed against hers for warmth and comfort. One of the pups let out a soft whimper, its tiny limbs struggling to stay still, its eyes still too young to understand the world around it. Jack's chest tightened as he took in the sight. The mother was barely standing, her once thick coat now soaked and frozen, the deep lines of exhaustion carved into her face. She looked like she had been through a storm far worse than the one raging outside. Her condition was dire, her frailty impossible to ignore. Yet despite the clear signs of suffering, there was a quiet determination in her stance. She had managed to survive, to bring her pups this far, despite the freezing cold and the brutal weather. She was fighting for herself, fighting for her babies. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized the magnitude of what he was seeing. This was not just a dog seeking shelter. This was a mother, doing everything she could to protect her young ones, despite the odds stacked against them. The weight of her struggle hit him all at once, and Jack knew, without a doubt, that he couldn't turn them away. The storm had brought them to his doorstep for a reason, and he was the only one who could help. His heart went out to her, to this brave creature who had already endured so much. She had nowhere else to go, and Jack, despite the uncertainty and the fear that bubbled up inside him, knew that he had to be the one to change that. Jack stood there, his hands still gripping the door, frozen in place. The cold air bit at his face, and the storm outside seemed to intensify, but inside, his mind was tangled in a much deeper struggle. His first instinct was to close the door, to turn away and leave the dog out in the storm. It was safer that way, wasn't it? He lived alone, kept to himself, and had never once thought of taking an estray, especially not one in such a condition. The dangers of letting an unknown animal into his home, the risks of what might come with it, weighed heavily on his mind. What if it wasn't just a lost dog? What if it brought trouble? What if it wasn't just a helpless animal, but something else? Something he couldn't handle. But then, as he stood there, the dog's eyes locked onto his, and something deep inside him stirred. Those eyes, full of fear, of desperation, and yet somehow still hopeful, spoke to him in a way nothing else ever had. It wasn't just the frailty of the dog or the tiny pups huddled against her. It was the quiet, pleading way she looked at him, as if she was asking for a chance, a moment of kindness in the middle of a brutal storm. Jack had lived a quiet life, far from the world's chaos, and yet in that moment, he couldn't ignore the pull to do something, to make a difference for this one soul standing in front of him. It was a feeling he hadn't had in years, not since his days as a firefighter, when he was always rushing to help others. He had gotten used to the calm of his retirement, the days of solitude where he didn't have to worry about anyone or anything. But now, standing in front of this dog and her pups, he realized that solitude had made him forget how to act when faced with real need. He wasn't used to feeling like this, like someone was depending on him. The hesitation lingered, as his mind fought against the desire to help. What if it all went wrong? What if he wasn't prepared for the responsibility? And yet, as the dog's gaze held his, that instinct to turn away faded. Something in her eyes told him that if he didn't act, if he didn't open the door and let them in, they might not make it. Jack's heart ached at the thought, and against all his doubts, he found himself reaching for the door handle once more, deciding that, for tonight at least, he couldn't walk away. Jack stood for a long moment, his fingers still wrapped around the doorknob, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind howled outside, and the snow seemed to swirl around him, but it was the stillness inside that pressed hardest against him. His mind raced, torn between the pull of his cautious instincts and the quiet plea in the dog's eyes. For a moment, he thought about all the reasons he shouldn't open the door. The danger, the unpredictability, the responsibility of caring for these animals, especially ones so frail and helpless. He was alone here after all. He had never planned for anything like this. The quiet life he had chosen didn't leave room for complications, for unexpected guests, or the weight of another survival on his shoulders. But then he looked down at the dog again, her eyes still locked on his, filled with a kind of silent desperation. The wind seemed to fade away, and there was only the sound of his own breath and the faint, soft whimpers of the puppies behind her. There was no more time for hesitation. He could see it in her. This wasn't just some dog wandering through the storm. This was a mother, and in her, Jack saw the strength of survival, the fierce determination to protect her young. She wasn't asking for much, just a chance to survive the night, to give her pups a safe place to rest. And in that moment, Jack knew he couldn't turn her away. Without another thought, he pushed the door open wider. The cold rushed in, biting at his skin, but he barely felt it now. The dog didn't hesitate. She stepped forward slowly, her movements cautious but determined, as though she had already made the decision for him. As she crossed the threshold, Jack's heart eased just a little. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't something to be afraid of. She was simply a creature in need. And in a way, Jack realized, they were both at the mercy of this storm, both caught in a moment of uncertainty. The dog made her way into the cabin, the warmth inside a stark contrast to the icy world outside. Jack closed the door behind them, shutting out the storm. As he looked down at the tiny pups huddled against their mother, the weight of the decision settled in. He had made it. There was no going back now. He had chosen to take them in, to offer them a place in the warmth of his home. The quiet of the cabin now felt different, fuller, as if something had shifted, something was about to change. And Jack knew deep down that this moment, the moment he opened the door, was a turning point in his life. Jack knelt slowly beside the dog, his hands trembling as he reached for the old blanket folded on the nearby chair. The warmth of the fire filled the room, but the mother dog's body still shook with the cold. He could see the way her muscles twitched under her fur, how her body was still fighting against the brutal weather outside. Her eyes watched him carefully, full of wariness, but also something else, something that told him she was starting to trust him. It was a small thing, but it was there like a crack in the wall she had built around herself. The trust wouldn't come all at once, but Jack knew this was the beginning. He moved slowly, deliberately, trying not to make any sudden moves that might startle her. He could feel her tension in the air, in the way she flinched when his hand got too close. But he didn't rush. Jack had learned long ago that trust wasn't something you could force. It had to be earned, one small step at a time. He draped the blanket gently over her and the pups, the fabric soft against their cold bodies. The mother flinched at first, her head pulling back slightly as if expecting the worst, but then she relaxed just a little. Her body shifted, and she let out a soft sigh, the first sign that she was beginning to let her guard down. The tiny pups, still shivering from the cold, nestled closer to their mother. Jack's heart ached as he watched them, their little bodies so small and fragile. They huddled against her for warmth, their tiny eyes still closed, trusting her completely to keep them safe. As he pulled the blanket tighter around them, he made sure not to move too fast, keeping his hands steady and calm. The last thing he wanted was to make them feel like they were in danger again. The dog let him work, her eyes still watching him, but not with the same level of fear. She wasn't growling or backing away. Instead, she seemed to accept the warmth he was offering, the comfort of the blanket, and for the first time since she had arrived, Jack saw her relax, even if it was just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him feel like he had done something right. He stepped back slowly, giving her space, but not without a quiet sense of accomplishment. The warmth of the cabin, the comfort of the blanket, and the quiet stillness of the moment all came together, marking the first real sign of trust between them. Jack knew that this was just the beginning, but it was a beginning worth holding on to. Jack stood for a moment, watching the dog and her pups, his mind working through what to do next. The warmth from the fire had settled around them, but the need for food and water was still pressing. He reached slowly for a bowl from the small cupboard, his movements careful, measured. The mother dog's eyes followed him, her gaze still full of wariness, but this time there was a slight softness to it. She hadn't moved away when he reached for the bowl, and that small act felt like a victory in itself. Jack filled the bowl with water, watching the clear liquid swirl inside, then turned back toward her. He crouched down in front of her, setting the bowl on the floor just a few inches away from where she lay with her pups. For a moment, she didn't move, her body tense, unsure of what he was offering. Jack held his breath, waiting for some sign of acceptance. He knew she was thirsty. He could see the way her body trembled, her ribs showing through her matted fur. But trusting him enough to drink was another step entirely. The room was silent. The only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle from the pups as they shifted against their mother. Slowly, cautiously, the dog leaned forward, her nose twitching as she sniffed the water. Jack stayed still, not wanting to rush her, not wanting to scare her. For a long moment, she hesitated, as if weighing the risk of taking something from him. Then, with a soft sigh, she lowered her head and took a tentative sip. Her tongue flicked the surface of the water, and for a brief moment, Jack's heart lightened. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was the first real sign of cooperation between them, a small step toward trust. As she drank, Jack knelt quietly beside her, keeping his presence calm, steady. The tension in the room hadn't fully dissipated, but there was a new sense of hope in the air. It was a quiet, fragile thing, but it was there. The dog finished drinking and pulled back, her eyes still cautious but not as fearful as before. She hadn't growled or pulled away, and that alone told Jack she was starting to realize he wasn't a threat. The connection between them, though still fragile, was beginning to grow. Jack slowly stood up, feeling a deep sense of relief. This small moment, this simple act of her drinking from the bowl, felt like a promise. A promise that, little by little, things could get better, that she could begin to trust him. Jack sat quietly across the room, watching the dog as she finally settled down near the fire, her body curled protectively around her pups. The blanket he had draped over her now lay in a tangle, but she seemed too exhausted to move. Her eyes, though still wary, had softened, and the sharpness of her earlier fear had faded, replaced by the weariness of someone who had simply given everything they had just to survive. As Jack observed her, his thoughts wandered back to the way she had looked when she first arrived. Her thin, frail frame, the ice clinging to her fur, and the desperate way she had leaned into the warmth of the cabin. He couldn't help but notice her ribs, each one painfully visible beneath her matted coat, a clear sign of how much she had been through. He couldn't shake the image of her like that, so broken, so close to giving up. What had brought her here? Where had she come from? Jack wondered about the harsh journey she must have endured, surviving out in the storm, alone, with nothing but the will to keep going. He could see the signs of hardship in the way she moved, the careful way she stepped, almost as if every motion caused her pain. It was as though her body had been through too many battles. She was malnourished, and the way her body trembled even in the warmth of the cabin made it clear that she had been living on the edge for far too long. But despite all of this, she had still managed to find her way here, to his door, at the mercy of the storm. Jack's mind raced with questions. Was she abandoned? Had someone left her out there to fend for herself? The thought made his stomach twist. The world could be cruel, and sometimes people weren't kind to animals. He wondered if she had been someone's dog once, cared for, maybe even loved. But whatever had happened, whatever pain she had endured, she was here now, and that was all that mattered. Jack reached out slowly, his eyes never leaving her as she rested, and for the first time, he felt a deep sadness for her. It was hard to imagine what kind of life she had led, what she had been through before she ended up on his doorstep. But in that moment, all he could do was promise her that things would be different now. She wouldn't have to fight anymore. She would find peace here. Jack just hoped it would be enough to heal the deep scars she carried inside. Jack watched the dog closely as she lay resting, her body still trembling slightly, despite the warmth of the cabin. Her eyes, though softer now, still held a trace of fear, a wariness that made her look ready to bolt at any sudden movement. Every time Jack shifted in his chair or moved closer, her gaze flickered toward him, her muscles tensing just enough to let him know she wasn't entirely comfortable. Not yet. But there was something else in her eyes, something deeper than fear. Amid the wariness, Jack saw a quiet strength, a determination that spoke louder than the hesitation she still held. It wasn't just the way she protected her pups, her every movement instinctively shielding them. It was in the way she looked at him, vulnerable, yes, but not broken. There was a fire in her, a spark that told Jack she had survived much worse than this. She had been through the storm, both the one outside and the one within herself. And yet here she was still standing, still fighting for her pups, still holding on. Jack couldn't help but admire that resilience. She had lived through unimaginable hardship, and yet she hadn't given up. Her fear was clear, but it was not the kind of fear that made her weak. It was the kind of fear that came from surviving, from being hurt before, from learning to trust only when there was no other choice. Jack could see that she wasn't just trying to survive the storm. She was trying to heal, to find safety, to let go of the fear that had kept her on edge for so long. But it wouldn't be easy. Jack knew that. The walls she had built to protect herself were strong, and they wouldn't come down quickly. But the longer he watched her, the more he saw that she had already begun to trust, even just a little. The signs were there, subtle but undeniable. Her eyes, though still full of caution, didn't shy away when he moved closer. Her body, once tense and alert at every noise, now relaxed just a fraction. It was a slow process, but Jack could see that she was willing to take that first step. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else, something stronger. Jack couldn't say how long it would take for her to fully trust him, but in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. The dog was not just a victim of her past. She was a survivor, and whatever had happened to her, she had the strength to rise above it. As Jack sat back in his chair, watching the dog and her pup settle into the warmth of the cabin, a heavy weight began to settle on his shoulders. The reality of the situation hit him like a wave, one he hadn't fully prepared for. The dog wasn't just some stray animal. She was a mother, and those tiny pups, so fragile and small, depended on him now. The thought of taking on such responsibility felt overwhelming. Jack had spent years alone, living in peaceful solitude. His days had been simple, quiet. He never expected to care for anything beyond himself again. But now, with this dog and her pups looking to him for safety, for care, for something he wasn't sure he could give, he felt the weight of it all. He couldn't help but wonder if he was up to the task. He wasn't a young man anymore, and though he had cared for others in his past, during his years as a firefighter, this was different. This wasn't an emergency he could handle with quick decisions and clear action. This was long-term. This was care that would require patience, consistency, and commitment. Jack had never planned on taking in a family of animals. He didn't know the first thing about raising puppies or caring for a malnourished dog. He wasn't sure he had what it took to provide for them, to give them the life they deserved. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if he wasn't enough? What if his quiet, simple life wasn't enough to make up for what they had lost? The storm outside seemed to echo his uncertainty, the howling wind a reminder of how fragile life could be. What if his best wasn't good enough? What if he failed them? But then Jack looked at the dog again, her tired eyes watching him with a quiet trust, and his heart softened. He thought of the long, difficult journey she had been on, the storm she had fought through just to get here. She had made it this far, and now she was looking to him for help. He couldn't turn his back on that. He couldn't walk away from the responsibility, no matter how overwhelming it seemed. Deep down, he knew what he had to do. He had chosen to open the door, to let them in, and now he had to follow through. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to turn them away. He would do what he could, no matter how hard it might get. For the first time in a long while, Jack realized that sometimes you don't have to be ready to take care of something. You just have to care enough to try. And that he was willing to do. Jack watched the dog and her pups for a long time, his gaze softening as they curled together in front of the fire. The mother lay with her head resting on her paws, her body still weary, but at least safe for now. The pups were nestled close to her, their tiny bodies still, each of them taking in the warmth of the cabin. Jack could see the relief in their quiet, gentle breathing. For the first time since they had arrived, there was peace in the room, a fragile peace, but peace all the same. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, or the next day, or how things would unfold. So much was uncertain. But as he sat there, watching them, a thought began to form in his mind. He couldn't turn back now. He had opened his door to them, and now they were here, depending on him. Jack knew it wasn't just about offering shelter for one night, or even 1 week. This was a promise he hadn't spoken out loud, but that settled in his heart like a quiet vow. No matter what came next, no matter how difficult or uncertain things might be, he would take care of them. The dog and her pups would be safe. They would have a place here. Jack wasn't sure what that would look like yet, what it would require of him, or what challenges might come along the way. But in that moment, as he watched them resting quietly, he knew that there was no turning back. He couldn't imagine sending them back into the storm, couldn't imagine leaving them to fend for themselves after all they had been through. This wasn't just about offering warmth for a night or a bowl of water. It was about something deeper, something more lasting. Jack knew that this was a responsibility he had to accept, not out of obligation, but out of something much stronger. There was a bond forming here, even if it was still fragile, and he wasn't about to walk away from it. He looked down at the dog, her eyes closed now in quiet rest, and he whispered a silent promise to her. He would care for them. He would protect them. No matter what happened, no matter how uncertain the future might be, they wouldn't be alone anymore. Jack stood up slowly, feeling the weight of his commitment, but also a sense of peace. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it. And for the first time in a long while, he knew that he wasn't alone in the world anymore. The drive to the veterinary clinic was quieter than Jack expected. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world still and peaceful, but the weight of the journey ahead pressed heavily on him. Grace sat quietly in the back of the truck, her body curled protectively around her pups. Jack kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his thoughts consumed with worry. He had seen how fragile she was when she had first arrived at his cabin, and he wasn't sure what to expect at the clinic. What if they couldn't help her? What if the damage was too much? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he kept his focus on the road, telling himself that he had done the right thing, that he had to trust the vet. When they arrived, Jack carefully lifted Grace and her pups from the truck, trying to keep them calm and steady as he walked toward the entrance. The clinic was small but welcoming, with soft lighting and a sense of calm that contrasted the anxiety Jack felt inside. He carried Grace in his arms, cradling her like a fragile piece of glass, while the pups followed close behind. The vet, a kind woman with gentle eyes, took one look at Grace and immediately moved into action. Jack watched as she carefully examined the dog, her hands soft but thorough, noting the signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. After a few tense moments, the vet looked up at Jack, her expression serious but reassuring. "She's in poor condition," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. "Her ribs are showing, and she's clearly been through a lot. But with time, proper care, and the right nutrition, she'll recover." Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him, though the worry didn't entirely fade. He knew recovery wouldn't be easy. It would take patience and time and a lot of care. But hearing the vet's words gave him hope. She wasn't beyond help. The vet gently examined the pups, making sure they were healthy enough to start eating solid food, checking for any signs of distress. "They're small, but they're strong," she said with a smile, her fingers brushing over their tiny bodies. "They've got a good chance, too, as long as we get them the right care." Jack nodded, grateful but still unsure of what lay ahead. The road to recovery wouldn't be quick, and there was still so much to do. But for the first time since they had arrived at his cabin, Jack felt like they had a real chance. They weren't alone in this fight anymore. And with time, care, and patience, they would all heal. As Jack drove away from the clinic, the truck felt quieter than before. The pups were settled in the back, resting after their checkup while Grace lay beside him, her body still weak but calmer now. The vet's words echoed in his mind, offering a sense of relief. With time, proper care, and the right nutrition, they'll recover. That was all he needed to hear to give him a glimmer of hope. Yet, as the road stretched ahead, that hope was tangled with a deep sense of uncertainty. The road to recovery would not be quick or easy. The dogs were in poor shape, and the vet had warned that it could take months for them to regain their strength. Jack wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of challenge, but he knew there was no turning back now. He had made a promise to them, to Grace and her pups, and he was determined to keep it. The thought of caring for them through their healing process, of being the one to guide them through every step, brought a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was relieved that they were getting the help they needed. The weight of their fragility, the concern he had felt since the moment they arrived, had been lessened. But there was still so much left to do. So much was unknown. Would they make it through? Would Grace and her pups fully recover? The vet had been confident, but Jack couldn't shake the nagging doubt that lingered in his mind. It wasn't that he doubted their strength. He had seen the resilience in Grace's eyes. But what if his own strength wasn't enough? What if he couldn't provide the care they needed, especially when it came to the long days ahead? The thought of failing them was one that Jack couldn't push away. As the truck bumped along the road, Jack stole a glance at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Grace's tired eyes. She was resting, but there was still a guardedness to her. She was still wary, still holding back, and Jack understood. She had been through so much, and now, just as he had promised, he was here to guide them, to help them heal. But in his heart, he knew this was just the beginning. There would be good days, and there would be bad days. Days of progress and setbacks. And through it all, Jack would have to stay strong for them, even when his own doubts crept in. But for now, he took a deep breath and focused on the small victories. Grace was alive, the pups were thriving, and they were all together. That at least was something, and with that, he pressed on, hoping that the future would be brighter than the storm that had brought them here. In the days that followed, Jack could see small but significant changes in Grace. Her once dull coat, matted and brittle from the cold and neglect, began to shine with life again. The first time he noticed it, he couldn't help but smile. The thinness that had made her ribs so visible was slowly beginning to fade, replaced by the healthy fullness of a dog who was starting to feel safe and cared for. Each day, as he filled her bowl with food, she ate more eagerly, her strength returning little by little. She still moved slowly, her joints stiff from the months of hardship, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The trembling had lessened, and though she still spent much of her time lying down near the fire, her body was no longer constantly shivering in pain. Jack watched over her closely, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. It wasn't just about feeding her. It was about seeing the transformation in her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was healing. The warmth of the cabin, the food, the care Jack was offering, it was all adding up. Slowly, the dog that had stumbled in from the storm, half dead from exhaustion, was becoming something else. She was becoming the dog she was meant to be. Strong, full of life, and capable of being part of something again. Jack noticed the little things. The way her tail wagged just slightly when he came near, the way she would lift her head when she heard his voice. It was all a sign that she was starting to trust him, starting to believe that this new life could be one of safety and care. As the days went by, Jack started to notice that the distance between them was closing. Grace, though still cautious, no longer flinched at his every movement. At first, when Jack would reach out to pet her, she would tense up, her body stiff with the instinct to protect herself. But now, she would let him approach. The first time he reached out to her and gently placed his hand on her back, she didn't pull away. She didn't growl or stiffen, but instead, she leaned into his touch, her body relaxing. Jack kept his movements slow and steady, his voice soft as he spoke to her, offering her the comfort of his presence. "You're safe here, Grace," he would say, and with each word, she seemed to respond a little more. Her eyes, once filled with fear and caution, began to soften. There was still a wariness in them, but now it was mixed with something else, something he could only describe as gratitude. One evening, as Jack sat on the floor near the fire, Grace slowly crawled closer to him, her body hesitant, but filled with the quiet courage of a dog learning to trust again. She sat just a few feet away, watching him with soft eyes, her ears perked. Jack gently spoke to her, his voice steady and warm. "It's okay, girl. You're all right." She looked at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, she let out a soft sigh. Jack reached out, slowly moving his hand toward her. He felt the tremble in her body as his fingers brushed over her fur, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment as if savoring the contact. It was the first real moment of connection between them, and Jack's heart lifted at the feeling of her trust, fragile yet real. From that point on, Grace became more and more comfortable in her new home. She started to follow Jack around the cabin, staying close to him, as though she was beginning to see him as someone she could rely on. When he sat in his chair by the fire, she would curl up nearby, her eyes always following him, but now with a softness that showed she was no longer afraid. Jack spoke to her often, telling her about his day, telling her things that weren't important, but it was a way to bridge the gap between them. And as the days passed, Grace's response grew warmer. Her tail would wag just a little when he spoke to her, and when he petted her, she would lean into him more, no longer the tense, wary dog that had first stepped into his cabin. It wasn't a fast process, but Jack could see it happening, little by little, the healing of both the body and the heart. Trust, once broken, was slowly being rebuilt. Grace was becoming part of Jack's life, and in return, Jack was becoming a part of hers. They were starting to heal together, and Jack couldn't help but feel that in some way, she had saved him too. As the days passed, Jack began to notice a change in the pups. They were no longer the fragile, tiny bundles he had first seen, barely able to move or open their eyes. Now, their little bodies were growing stronger with each passing day. Their eyes started to open wider, and their tiny paws began to stumble and shuffle across the floor. Jack would watch them from his chair by the fire, a quiet smile tugging at his lips as the pups started to explore their new world. Their tiny tails would wag with excitement as they crawled toward the corners of the room, their movements still a little clumsy, but filled with curiosity. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were starting to live, to discover the world around them. Every time one of the pups wobbled across the floor, their little tails wagging furiously, Jack felt a rush of joy. It was such a simple thing, watching them move, but it was a reminder of how far they had come. The tension and uncertainty that had filled the cabin when Grace first arrived were slowly melting away, replaced by the pure, innocent joy of life. The pups' tiny yips echoed through the room as they tried to play with each other, their legs still shaky, but their spirits strong. They had a fight in them, just like their mother. Every time they bumped into a piece of furniture or tripped over each other, they would pause for a moment, shake themselves off, and keep going. There was no giving up in them. Jack couldn't help but laugh softly as one of the pups tried to chase its tail, spinning in circles, its little body tumbling over itself. It was a sound that filled the room with warmth, a contrast to the quiet, tense moments of fear that had marked the beginning of their journey. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, these pups had been so weak and helpless, their tiny forms trembling in the cold. Now they were beginning to play, to explore, to grow into the little dogs they were meant to be. The change in them was a reminder that life, even in its most fragile moments, still found a way to push forward. Grace watched them from her spot by the fire, her eyes soft as she kept a watchful eye on her pups. She wasn't as tense as she had been when they first arrived, her body more relaxed, her focus now on her pups' antics rather than the fears that had once gripped her. As Jack sat back and watched the pups grow stronger, he felt a quiet sense of pride. This was what he had promised them, a chance to live, to heal, to grow. The uncertainty of the past seemed far away now, replaced by the undeniable strength of these tiny creatures and the joy they brought to the cabin every day. It was an ordinary evening, the kind Jack had grown used to since Grace and her pups had arrived. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light across the room, while the puppies tumbled playfully around the cabin. Grace lay nearby, her watchful eyes on her pups, her body more relaxed than it had been when she first arrived. Jack sat back in his chair, a cup of coffee in his hands, feeling a quiet peace settle over him. The storm had long passed, and the world outside was calm. But that evening, something felt different. It was a shift in the air, something Jack couldn't quite place. He glanced out the window, his eyes catching a shadow at the edge of the property. At first, he thought it was just the flickering of the trees swaying in the breeze, but then he saw it again, a figure standing in the distance, just outside the reach of the cabin's light. Jack's breath caught, his grip tightening around the cup. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if they were simply waiting, watching the cabin from afar. The wind had died down, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Jack's heart beat a little faster, a cold feeling creeping up his spine. He couldn't see the person clearly, but something about the stillness, the way the figure stood there unmoving, filled him with unease. He wasn't sure who it was or what they wanted, but he knew they weren't a passerby. This wasn't just some traveler caught in the storm. Jack turned his gaze to Grace. Her body had gone rigid, her eyes locked on the door, her ears twitching at every sound. Then, without a word, she stood up, her posture defensive, her body low to the ground. She growled softly at first, but the sound deepened as her eyes remained fixed on the spot outside. Her tail stiffened, and Jack could see the tension in her muscles. She knew something was wrong. Jack stood, his heart racing as he walked toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The figure was still there, unmoving, watching, waiting. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random stranger. There was something familiar about the way the figure stood, the way they didn't move. It reminded him of someone who had purposefully chosen to stay hidden, someone who didn't want to be seen but wasn't leaving either. Grace's growl became more pronounced, and Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. She wasn't just reacting to the presence of a stranger. She was reacting as if she recognized this person. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Who could it be? Jack's mind raced with possibilities. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Grace had been through so much already, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this person outside was connected to her past. He had seen the way Grace reacted when she first arrived, so full of fear, so protective of her pups. She had been through something terrible, and Jack wondered if this person out there had been part of it. He didn't know who they were, but he knew one thing for certain. They weren't here for a friendly visit. The unease in Jack's chest only grew as the minutes stretched on. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if they were waiting for something, maybe for the right moment to act. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He could feel the weight of Grace's gaze on him, her watchful eyes never leaving the door. Her growl had stopped, but the tension in her body told him she was ready. Ready for something. Jack's thoughts raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. He could feel it in his gut, that sense of dread. This wasn't just some random person passing through. Whoever they were, they had a reason for being here, and it wasn't good. Jack reached for his rifle, careful not to make too much noise, his eyes never leaving the figure outside. He didn't know what he was going to do once he confronted them. He didn't know what to expect, but he couldn't just sit there and wait. He couldn't ignore the danger that was so clearly standing at the edge of his property. Grace had already picked up on it, and Jack wasn't going to let whatever threat this was get any closer. He had made a promise to protect her, to protect the pups, and he wasn't about to let that promise be broken now. Steeling himself, Jack made his way toward the door, glancing once more at Grace, who had stopped growling but was still standing guard. Her eyes met his, and in that moment he understood. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. She wasn't trembling or cowering like she had when she first arrived. She was strong, and she was ready. This wasn't just his fight anymore. Grace had come a long way since that night in the storm, and now, together, they would face whatever came their way. Jack opened the door slowly, the cool air rushing in, and stepped out into the night. The figure remained at the edge of the property, still and silent. Jack's grip on the rifle tightened, and he took a step forward. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to back down. The stranger had been watching long enough. Now it was time to confront whatever danger they brought with them. As Jack moved closer, his heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his eyes locked on the figure. Whatever their connection to Grace's past was, Jack would face it head-on. He wasn't alone anymore, and he wasn't going to let anything threaten the safety they had fought so hard to build. As Jack stepped closer to the figure standing at the edge of the property, the cold night air felt even sharper, pressing against his skin like a warning. His hand tightened around the rifle, the weight of it familiar but heavy in his grip. The stranger's silhouette remained unmoving, barely visible in the dark, but Jack could feel the intensity of the situation growing with every step. When he was just a few feet away, the figure finally spoke, his voice low and firm, cutting through the silence of the night. "That dog is mine," he said, the words coming out like a command, full of authority. "I'm taking her back." Jack's heart skipped a beat, a rush of anger flooding through him. He stopped in his tracks, the rifle still raised but steady in his hands. The stranger's words were like a spark to dry wood, igniting a fury inside Jack that he hadn't felt in a long time. This man was claiming Grace, the dog who had trusted him, the dog he had promised to protect, as if she were some possession to be handed back over. Jack's grip on the rifle tightened, his jaw clenching. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "No," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "She's not going anywhere. Not with you." The words hung in the air, thick with the tension of the moment. The stranger didn't move at first, as if weighing his next words carefully. Jack could feel his resolve hardening. He knew the man wasn't going to back down easily. There was something in the way he stood, in the way his hands were clenched, that told Jack this wasn't going to be a simple argument. But Jack wasn't backing down either. Grace had come to him in the storm, vulnerable and broken, and Jack had made a promise to her. He wasn't going to let this stranger take her back into whatever nightmare she had escaped from. For a moment, the stranger stood still, staring at Jack with a look that mixed anger and disbelief. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man growled, his voice low and dangerous. "That dog's nothing but trouble. She's better off with me. You don't want to get involved with something you can't handle." Jack's eyes locked with the man's, his stance firm and unwavering. "I don't care what she was to you," he said quietly. "What matters now is that she's here, and she's safe. You're not taking her." The stranger took a step forward, his posture aggressive, his eyes narrowing as he sized Jack up. The tension in the air was palpable, crackling like the storm that had brought Grace to the cabin. But before the man could take another step, Grace reacted. Her body, which had been standing quietly by Jack's side, shifted into a defensive stance. Her head lowered slightly, her ears flattened against her head, and her body stiffened. The growl that had been building in her throat turned into a deep, menacing sound, one that reverberated in the stillness of the night. The stranger stopped in his tracks, his eyes darting to Grace, then back to Jack. For a moment, the air seemed to freeze, and Jack could feel the tension shift from just him and the stranger to something much larger. Something that was no longer just about a man wanting to take a dog. It was about Grace's protection, about her need to defend her pups, to protect her new home. The growl that had started as a warning now became a full-fledged protective act. Grace's muscles tensed, and she stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the stranger, her body a line of defense between him and her pups. She wasn't just guarding herself anymore. She was guarding her family, her new home, and the bond she had started to build with Jack. The stranger took a step back, his eyes flicking nervously between Jack and Grace. The growl deepened, and Grace's stance became even more intimidating. She was no longer just a fearful, injured dog. She was a mother, a protector, and she would not let anyone harm her or her pups. Jack could see it in her, the strength that had been hidden under the layers of fear and pain she had carried with her. This wasn't just about the man's ownership. It was about survival, about protecting what was hers, what she had fought to keep safe. The stranger hesitated, his eyes shifting uncomfortably as the weight of Grace's protective stance settled over him. Jack stood tall, unwavering, his eyes locked onto the man's. "I told you," Jack said firmly, his voice carrying a calm but unbreakable edge. "She's not yours anymore. She's part of this family now, and I'm not going to let you take her." The man shifted uncomfortably, his posture faltering as he realized he wasn't going to win this fight. Grace's growl was steady, low, and threatening, and Jack's unwavering resolve only added to the tension. The stranger took one last look at Grace, his expression faltering, then slowly backed away, his eyes never leaving Jack or the dog. "You'll regret this," he muttered under his breath, before turning and disappearing into the darkness of the night. Jack stood there, rifle still raised, his breath steady but his heart pounding in his chest. The danger had passed for now, but he knew the threat wasn't completely gone. The stranger might return, or there could be more like him out there, waiting for their chance to take what they thought they owned. But for now, Grace was safe. She had defended herself, and Jack had stood by her, just as he promised. As the night fell silent again, Jack slowly lowered the rifle and turned to Grace, who had relaxed, her body no longer tense, but still alert. He walked over to her, crouching down to meet her eyes, and softly whispered, "You did good, girl." Grace looked back at him, her gaze calm, and for the first time, Jack felt the full weight of the bond they had formed. It wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about protecting each other, together. Grace had come a long way since that first night she stumbled into Jack's cabin, her body frail and her eyes filled with fear. Now, she lay peacefully beside the fire, her pups nestled against her, their tiny bodies warm and content. The room was calm, the flickering flames casting a soft glow across the floor as the puppies slept soundly, their little breaths steady and soft. Grace had curled herself protectively around them, but there was no tension in her body anymore. No more anxious shifting or wary glances. She was finally at ease. The storm had passed, not just outside, but in her heart as well. Jack sat in his chair, watching them, a quiet sense of pride filling him. He hadn't realized just how much things had changed until this moment, until he saw how far they had all come. It wasn't just Grace who had healed. Jack had changed too, in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. When Grace first appeared at his doorstep, Jack had been hesitant, unsure of how to care for her, uncertain if he was capable of offering the help she needed. He had lived alone for so long, embraced the peace of his quiet life, and now, suddenly, he was responsible for not just one, but 3 lives. He hadn't expected any of this. The quiet, solitary existence he had known was slowly fading away, replaced by the bustling, tender moments of a family forming. And as he sat there, watching Grace and her pups, Jack realized that he had grown along with them. He had learned to be patient, to care in ways he hadn't before. The lessons had come hard, sometimes with doubt and fear, but they had come, and they had changed him. Jack could see it now, the bond that had formed between him and Grace, between him and her pups. It was more than just the shelter he had provided. It was the trust, the mutual care, the connection that had built slowly over time. He had given them safety, and in return, they had given him something unexpected, a sense of purpose, of belonging, that had been missing from his life for years. He had thought his retirement was the end of his story, the last chapter of a quiet life. But in the warmth of the cabin, in the steady sound of the pups' breaths, Jack realized that it was just the beginning. He had a role to play now, not just as a caretaker, but as part of a family he hadn't known he needed until Grace had walked through that door. The quiet of the cabin, once a symbol of loneliness and solitude, now felt different. It was still peaceful, but it no longer held the weight of emptiness. The soft sounds of the pups playing, the occasional rustle of Grace shifting in her sleep, and the warmth of their shared space made Jack feel more connected to the world than he had in years. His days had meaning again. There were no more long, silent hours spent staring at the walls. No more nights where he wondered if he had made the right choice to live alone. Now his life had direction, purpose, and it was all because of the quiet strength of Grace and her pups. He didn't have all the answers yet, and he knew there would be challenges ahead. There always were. But Jack wasn't afraid of them anymore. He knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, as a family. As he sat there, his gaze never leaving Grace and her pups, Jack realized how much they had filled a void in his heart he hadn't even known was there. He had spent so many years content in his solitude, convinced that being alone was the life he wanted. But now, with Grace's gentle presence by the fire and the soft yips of the pups filling the room, Jack understood that life was meant to be shared. The quiet was still there, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the warmth of new life, of growth, and of love that Jack hadn't known he had in him. The cabin, once a place of retreat, had become a home, something much more than a building. It had become a place where he was needed, where his actions mattered. The weight of it all, the sense of responsibility, no longer felt heavy. It felt right. Grace and her pups had brought a new rhythm to his days, one that was steady, grounded in the simple acts of caring for them and watching them grow. And as he sat back in his chair, letting the warmth of the fire wash over him, Jack realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't just going through the motions of life. He was living it in a way that felt full and real. And that, he knew, was a gift he hadn't expected, but one he would treasure every day. The cabin no longer felt like the end of something. It felt like the start of a new chapter, one that would be written with the laughter of pups, the quiet moments with Grace, and the lessons Jack would learn as he embraced his new role as protector, as family. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Jack wasn't afraid of it. He had a purpose now, and that purpose was right in front of him, curled up by the fire, asleep in peace. Jack sat by the fire, his eyes still on Grace and her pups, a soft smile on his face as he thought about how far they had come. He had seen their transformation, from fragile creatures barely able to survive to strong, healthy dogs full of life. It had taken time, patience, and care, but the result was something beautiful, something he hadn't expected but was incredibly grateful for. As he reflected on their journey, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the bond he had formed with Grace and her pups, but for the second chance they had all given each other. Sometimes, Jack began, his voice softer now, filled with warmth, we all need a second chance. A chance to heal, to grow, to start fresh. And there are so many animals out there who are waiting for that chance. He paused, looking at Grace, who was resting peacefully with her pups. If you're able to, I encourage you to adopt, to help those who are struggling. There are so many shelters in need of support, and so many animals waiting for a place to call home. Every small act can make a difference, whether it's opening your door, donating to a shelter, or simply spreading the word about the importance of rescuing animals. Jack's eyes softened as he looked at the family in front of him, knowing that this story was just one of many. Grace's story, and the story of her pups, is one of resilience. He continued, his voice steady but full of emotion. It's about the power of second chances. It's about giving them the opportunity to heal, to trust, and to thrive. And sometimes in giving them that chance, we find that we too can heal. We can find a new purpose, a new connection. It's a bond that goes beyond words, beyond anything we can explain. It's the bond between a human and an animal, and it's one of the most powerful forces there is. He looked at Grace, her head resting on her paws, her pups curled up beside her. We've all been through difficult times, he said quietly. But the key is to never give up, to keep going, even when it feels like there's no way forward. There is always hope, and through compassion, through the willingness to help, we can spread that hope to others. Just like Grace found a second chance, we can all make a difference, one act of kindness at a time. Jack smiled softly as he leaned back in his chair, feeling a quiet peace settle over him. The journey wasn't over, but they had come so far together. So if you can give that second chance, Jack said, his voice full of conviction, you never know how much it can change a life. Yours, and there's